After the invention of the cotton gin, the threat of sale loomed larger than ever before, and laws were passed to keep slaves under a tighter watch. Some resisted by running away, others by stealing or refusing to work. A very few saw no other alternative but to take up arms. One was a slave named Gabriel, who stole a pig and was hauled into a courthouse outside Richmond, Virginia, in 1799.
Gabriel was caught stealing a pig. Instead of accepting the abuse, which of course every slave was supposed to accept, he threw the man to the ground, wrestled him to the ground, and bit off the better part of his left ear. That, of course, was a capital crime. Pig stealing was a common occurrence. Biting white people was something that it was not encouraged for black Virginians to do.
Gabriel was convicted of attacking and maiming the white man who caught him. To deter others from such crimes, he was publicly humiliated, branded, and forced to spend a month in jail. As Gabriel sat in his cell, he decided that the time was right to organize the slaves of Richmond and strike against those who were holding them in bondage.
The only time that slaves would have had any mobility without the most rigid observation of whites would have been on a Sunday, would have been at night. Religious gatherings could have, in some cases, provided an opportunity for people to meet. We must never forget that any kind of move toward liberation among blacks was a question of life and death.
Like all revolutionaries, Gabriel seemed to have very little concern for violence and danger. He was an enormous man, 6'2", 6'3", in a time of relatively shorter men. He was a blacksmith, so he was a man of enormous strength. He was described as having scars on his face. He was missing most of his front teeth, and I suspect that came from mixing it up in the quarters with other slaves. He was a man who people instinctively tended to follow, and he apparently feared very little.
After his release, Gabriel began hammering out instruments of war, turning shovels into swords and molding bullets. Through most of the year 1800, he recruited soldiers for a rebel army.
All the whites were to be massacred, except the Quakers, the Methodists, and the Frenchmen, and they were to be spared on account of their being friendly to liberty. They intended also to spare all the poor white women who had no slaves. Ben Woolfolk, conspirator.
Obviously, he was not a naive man. He realized that this would be black freedom born of white fear, not out of white magnanimity.
1,000 men was to be raised from Richmond, 600 from Ground Squirrel Bridge, and 400 from Goochland. The business of the insurrection had so far advanced that we were compelled, even if discovered, to go forward. Solomon, conspirator.
Gabriel decided his troops would move at midnight on August 30th, 1800, carrying a flag with the motto, "Death or Liberty."
We can imagine what it was like on that day in August in 1800, with scores of African Americans gathering on a Sunday to create this rebellion with picks and axe and knives and clubs, and what it must have been like for them, prepared to strike and yet unable to strike.
That very evening, one observer wrote, there came on the most terrible thunderstorm accompanied with an enormous rain. Rivers swelled, roads and bridges washed away, And when it became clear that the business, as it was called, would be impossible in the storm, Gabriel tried to postpone the revolt. But before morning, the plot was betrayed by 2 slaves.
What's phenomenal is how close it got. If the accounts and the inferences we can make about the numbers, that it lasted so long before any betrayal is quite extraordinary.
Gabriel went to trial on October 6th, 1800. He refused to testify or to explain his actions, but one of the rebels did make a statement.
I have nothing more to say in my defense than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and I am a willing sacrifice in their cause. And I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then, all this mockery of a trial?